Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the Responsible AI Forum preview. My name is Christoph Lüttke. I'm Professor of Business Ethics at the Technical University of Munich, and I'm the director of the TUM Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence. It's a great pleasure for me to open this two-day virtual event and moderate its first session. AI is clearly here to stay, and it will continue to transform our societies substantially. The most pressing question is how this transformation will take place and what the repercussions will be. The Institute for Ethics in AI seeks to be a leader in this process by exploring issues related to the use and impact of AI-based technologies. Founded in 2019, the IEAI now celebrates its first anniversary, actually this autumn. Through public events, research, and building partnerships with researchers and practitioners worldwide, the IEAI aims to address real-world challenges and contribute to the broader conversations and concerns surrounding ethics and AI on a global level. And as I often say, AI is a global challenge, and so is AI ethics. You will have a chance today to hear from members of our research projects and our growing networks, all united by their interest in the ethical development and use of AI-enabled technologies. At the heart of the IEAI lie its projects. Our research seeks to identify AI ethics-related challenges, deliver not just the usual research, but practical and action-oriented outcomes, and develop tangible frameworks, methodologies, and algorithmic tools to provide AI developers and practitioners with a set of ethical best practices. What makes our research so distinctive is its multi, and transdisciplinary character. In all our projects, we have principal investigators from at least two distinct disciplines working closely together towards the development of operational ethical frameworks in the field of AI. These principal investigators are supported by highly skilled researchers, experts, and doctoral students. Our 9 clusters represent the IEAI's current key research areas, with 14 individual projects conducted within these clusters. These research projects seek to answer questions such as, how can AI best be used in the workplace? Is it possible to integrate ethical behavior into autonomous vehicles? How might AI-driven marketing challenge consumer choice, autonomy, and behavior? And what ethical and performance challenges or risks may result from the use of AI in healthcare-related tasks? And the soul of IEAI is its people. We are really proud of our amazing international team. Our managing director, Caitlin Corrigan, and our human capital consists of 8 committed team members, 23 remarkable project PIs, and more than 30 highly skilled researchers, experts, consultants, and doctoral students. On behalf of the IEAI team, I would like to welcome you all to the TRAIF preview. Our Responsible AI Forum preview is a sneak peek into how the IEAI and its partners are promoting a sustainable, inclusive, and comprehensive framework for the use of AI that delivers global benefit. This event is also a tantalizing teaser of the Responsible AI Forum that will take place from 7th to 9th June 21 in Munich. Our international forum aims to bring together members of industry, civil society, government, and academia to discuss the most relevant and pressing issues related to the responsible use of AI through shared stories, cutting-edge research, and practical applications. TRAIF also aims to encourage exchange between research and practice through productive discussion and demonstration. You can learn more about TRAIF on our website and actively participate in our coming 3-day event by submitting your proposals for papers, workshops, and roundtables. We very much encourage people from academia, industry, government, and civil society to submit their abstracts or ideas. This call for proposals runs until January 31st, 2021. And with that, I would like to move on to introducing the topic of the first session, which is governing responsible AI in health crisis. So AI is a powerful tool that has the ability to amplify current positive efforts, but also entrench and increase harms and discrimination if not used responsibly. The COVID pandemic has made clear that there is a need for a coordinated, dedicated data and technology infrastructure and an ecosystem for tackling the societal threats. This crisis has also underlined the urgent need to discuss the ethical considerations in the use of AI and develop operational ethical frameworks in this field. In an effort to expand the scope of research on AI and its use in health-related crises, and to further promote the Global AI Ethics Consortium, which was founded on our initiative in this spring, the IEAI decided to support 5 new research projects with a total of around €500,000 in funding. All projects are multidisciplinary and involve collaboration between professors at UM and professors and researchers at other institutions. The projects are short-term in nature with a focus on providing insights to developers and policymakers considering the use of AI to manage the current pandemic, as well as prepare for future scenarios. Our aim is to move out of the general and abstract theories, frameworks, and guidelines and provide what is really needed, instructions, and that's instructions for applying AI ethics in a way that is technically feasible. What makes this panel special is that its participants are among the winners of our call for proposals for multidisciplinary research on ethics for the use of AI to manage pandemics and health-related crises. Allow me now to introduce you to our speakers, and in alphabetical order, we have first Dirk Brandt from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Dr. Brandt is an extraordinary senior lecturer in the School of Public Leadership at Stellenbosch University and an independent legal consultant. He's one of the principal investigators of the new project scenario-based approach to the design and use of ethical AI models in managing a health pandemic, working with Professor Groh of the Work Group on Social Computing from TUM School of Informatics. Second, we have Christian Jeffal, who is here from TUM. He is Assistant Professor for Law, Science and Technology at TUM, at the Munich Center for Technology and Society and the TUM School of Governance. He deals with the relationship between law and technology, focusing on new technologies such as AI and the Internet of Things. Third, we have Mark Finlay, who is here live from Singapore. Mark Finlay is Professor of Law at Singapore Management University and Director of the Center for AI and Data Governance. And both Professor Jeva and Finlay are PIs of the new project, Rule of Law, Legitimacy and Effective COVID Control Technologies. Then we have Jeannie Mary Patterson, who is here live from Melbourne. Jeannie Patterson is Professor of Law at the University of Melbourne and co-director of their Center for AI and Digital Ethics. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here. And finally, we have Stefan Verhulst, live from New York. Stefan is co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer of the Governance Laboratory, or short the GovLab, at New York University. Both Jeannie Patterson and Stefan Verhulst are principal investigators of our project, The Ethics and Practice of AI Localism, at a time of COVID-19 and beyond. They are working here with Matthias Uhl from the Junior Research Group on Ethics of Digitization at TUM. So before we start, just some virtual meeting etiquette. We will take questions from the audience following the statements of our panel members. You can submit these via the webinar Q&A function. So let's start. And it is my pleasure to first give the floor to Dirk. And yes, Dirk, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Christoph. It is really great to participate in this event today, and I must indicate at the start that the journey that we're on is quite exciting on this research project, working in a multidisciplinary team. And the focus of our research is on finding an ethical, legally sound approach to use AI models in assisting decision-making in managing health pandemics. And as Christoph indicated, I am the legal specialist in the team. The rest are mainly in computer science, machine learning experts, and we have a colleague dealing with the ethics. Can you move to the next slide, please? So the layout of our project briefly is to work in separate streams, but also together. First of all, looking at the foundations, the ethical considerations and values that should influence our work. Secondly, or simultaneously with that, looking at the legal issues and principles, and eventually designing a legal framework for ethical models in managing pandemics. At the same time, the group of our participants in the project that is busy with data simulations, and they will develop different scenarios. We will then apply the legal principles in the AI process, design suitable AI models, test it, verify the validity of it and the strength of it, analyze our results, and in the end, we hope to provide basically two sets of products or results. One is to give some legal guidance in the form of a framework, and secondly, also the technical specifications, the design specifications of ethical AI models to assist in managing health pandemics. Next slide. I mentioned that some of our group, some guys are working on simulation models, and it's basically three sets of data that they're simulating at the moment: long-term social networks, mobility and encounters, and disease models. And that is to a large degree influenced by the current COVID-19 crisis. Eventually, we will also, we would like to look at other diseases as well. So there might be modifications into the terms of the basic approach, but this is what we're currently busy with. And the next phase of that would be look at the intersection of these groups of data and development of different scenarios, and going into the machine learning phase of that. Next slide, please. So looking at the legal considerations, and there are really a whole range of documents throughout the world that's produced in the last year or two in particular, and all of them list some kind of guidelines or principles. We looked at many of those and essentially found some key pointers that would guide our research. If we want to have trustworthy or responsible AI, according to the expert group in the European Commission, it is basically three elements. It should be lawful, it should be ethical, and it should be robust. Another useful point of reference that I found was in the Singapore Model AI Governance Framework, and they use basically two key principles and indicate that it should be transparent and fair on the one hand, and secondly, that any AI models should be human-centric. Now, our point of departure is that we should develop AI models that can benefit society. So a human-centric approach certainly is a key driver, and that is underpinned by a set of values. Next slide, please. So out of all those, there are certain key legal principles that we argue should apply, and those are transparency, accountability, dignity that relates to equality and fairness, privacy and protection of personal data. Those four in particular, but there might be others as well. For example, the principle of human autonomy, the fact that there should be some form of oversight and human control in the process. And then it is important, as we work in a health context, we understand that there might be additional considerations, in particular relating to dignity, protection of privacy and personal data. And it might be that other issues like intellectual property might come into play at some point as well. So the health contexts are very important, and within the health context, there could be even different or slight different in an approach, depending on exactly what application for the AI one is looking at. The last point that we're looking at is the governance issues. And in terms of governance, what we mean by that is really a comprehensive approach looking at the ethical values, legal principles, and the oversight mechanisms that combine to support the development of responsible or trustworthy AI. Next slide, please. It is not a theoretical exercise or doesn't take place in a vacuum. Once one understands the legal principles and the importance of how that guides the development of AI, it is our submission that it should follow a process-based approach, meaning that throughout the AI lifecycle, these legal considerations have a role to play. From the acquisition of data through the design phase, the application and testing of the AI model, looking at the impact of that in society, in the particular context that it will be applied, it is crucial that that there's not a once-off exercise of checking in the form of a tick box exercise if the legal considerations are applied or not. It is applicable throughout the process. So there's an interrelatedness in terms of the principles, but in also relating to the design of the AI as well, the technical side of it. If we really want to focus and develop a trustworthy AI model. Next one. Yeah, lastly, I think it is important to understand that if you want to create a human-centric approach and a trustworthy, reliable AI model to help decision-making in managing health pandemics, there should be a clear understanding of the interrelatedness of all these principles amongst each other, but also with the technical side of it. To really influence and shape the eventual end product that we want to achieve. And that is a tool that can help decision makers to manage pandemics in a much more efficient and informed way. And we hope that in a couple of months' time, we would be able to provide that. We're confident, but I think in modesty, I would rather say that we look forward to interesting results flowing out of this project. So thank you, Christoph. That is my input at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for this wonderful input about your project. And so then I would like to hand over to Christian Jeffal.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So good afternoon, but I shall also say good morning and good evening, since I think we have an international audience. It's a great pleasure to present our work. By that, I mean, of course, MARC, the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and my research group here, which is very much a work in progress, but I think it's great to share what we've already accomplished here in my group and in Mark's group concerning rule of law, legitimacy, and effective COVID-19 control technologies. So for us, it's really, or for me, it's really putting together the pieces of a puzzle, and that's also the metaphor I would like to offer to you, because what I think we see generally as a point of introduction is that general things we thought about AI now come to the fore, now that in the COVID-19 crisis, its technologies are even more important than before. We can use them in many different respects. Innovation is possible and really ups the game. And it's important to assess this from a perspective of human rights, democracy, and not least the rule of law, and to engage in responsible research and innovation. So what we are doing is to couple the rule of law and to strengthen that. And Mark, I'm sure, will comment more on the nature of the rule of law and the advantages. But to really operationalize this very important part of the triad of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and to make it manageable, also to assess COVID-19 control technologies that pop up all over the world. Yeah. And in order to do that, we engage in what Christoph Lütke has said, and really try to take a multidisciplinary but also multi-sector and multi-level approach in order to understand things. So we engage in the micro, meso, and macro level in order to come up with tangible results that enable an effective way to assess these technologies. So let me give you just some highlights, because I don't want to overstretch my time, but just some highlights from each of those levels. And on the micro level, I think it's really important for us here at TUM to have access to specific projects that try to push best practices in the wake of the crisis. And this was the Contact TUM group and the Chroniton group. Both came up with specific applications. In the case of Contact TUM, it's a contact tracing app that was actually also programmed together with the ITO consortium, and that many of the ideas also went into the actual German contact tracing app. So the team of Professor Desconi and Professor Schönert from TUM really tried to do it as data protection friendly as possible. And I will not go through the details, but you may have heard about the decentralized contact tracing approach. And I think this has a big impact, because it's also important for data governance and indirectly for data concerning AI. So this was one project which we consulted also from the legal side, and in which we learned a lot about the intricate design choices of those projects. And the other one is Chroniton, which is a QR-based app, but not a mobile app, but a general web app for local contact tracing. And it's now applied at TUM. So our students, when they, for example, write exams or do things where they have to come in, they use this Chroniton system. And we were lucky enough to have the possibility to work together with Professor Kahle, who drew up this system. It looks kind of like this, but I think the important takeaway here is that through multiple encryption, we have a very, very data protection friendly solution that can be used only to contact those affected by an incident and for nothing else. So it's not possible for any authorities to access the data. So this is the kind of takeaways we have in order to inform our project. But of course, the meso level is also very important. On the one hand, to observe what's happening in responsible research and innovation, but also to engage in a critical stance from a rule of law perspective. There is a lot of technologies furthering good purposes. I bring here an example from the United Nations, the Global Pulse unit from the United Nations, and they model the impact in certain refugee camps, and are also able to map and to project that. So actually, AI is able to further good purposes. And I think it's a very good time to stress that and to come up with especially these kind of innovations. But on the other hand, one has to be very critical of potential problems. To mention just a few highlights from Germany, inclusion and accessibility was a big problem for the German app. The German app is very successful, but there are certain parts of the population not using a mobile phone or having an old mobile phone, not being able to buy a new one, which are excluded, for example, from the use. And even though I'm very fond on data protection, a large part, if you analyze app reviews, which we are trying and planning to do, if you analyze the app reviews, you see that there is many people criticizing that certain data is not accessible to them. And then, of course, there comes an answer about data protection, but this shows that consent and self-determination might be even a problem in deciding what the level of data protection should be. So critical stance towards these technologies. And then I'm going to be very brief on the macro level, but I think the way we govern it is very important. And I'm going to finish in few seconds, but just to tell you, it's very important to analyze governance models and to also bring in rule of law experience in the governance of these technologies, because there is a lot of experience out there. And if that works, then hopefully the pieces of the puzzle come together, and our assessment tool helps to not only assess applications, but to actually make them better, which would be for us a way forward, as you see in this picture on the puzzle. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Christian, for giving us this great insight into COVID control technologies. And next, I would like to hand over to Mark Finlay from Singapore. You have the floor.
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you, Caitlin. And it's always interesting to come in after Christian's discussion about specific applications that his work has been directed towards. One of the reasons that I think the trio of interests that are our project, which is TUM, our centre, and BICL, the British Institute for International and Comparative Law, why we've come together is from different research interests around a common core. And the common core is the way in which rule of law can add value to real regulatory impact. It's interesting when we see in the German context the tracing and tracking apps, which are reasonably successful, and in the TUM context, the way in which the university has adapted these to a particular principle design framework. But I can say from the work that we've done, that's unusual when you look at the world experience. The world experience is not that. In fact, the world experience is that the majority of tracing and tracking applications which are AI assisted are not supported by the community. They're not trusted, and therefore their efficacy levels are low. In Singapore, for example, we have a very successful control policy framework, but even so, the attitude of the community to tracing and tracking apps is quite suspicious. And as a result of that, the Singapore government's decided to incorporate tracing and tracking and safe entry into one they don't say compulsory, but one fairly required process to be able to benefit from free access in particular situations. We came to this project, I think, at two levels. One was from the experience we've had with COVID research in a variety of different places looking at the disquiet associated with tracing and tracking apps, looking at the disconnect between ethical principles and the design of many of these applications, looking at the problems associated, for example, with the use of applications like this and discrimination against vulnerable groups. In Singapore, it's migrant labor. In India, it's the same. If you look at Korea, it's LGBT communities. If you look at other parts of the world, there are vulnerable groups that have been impacted negatively by the development of AI-assisted surveillance technology, which has not grown from a principle design framework. Now, the other reason that we've come to this with an interest is a somewhat, let's say, critical approach to an over-reliance on ethics. We've been involved very actively in some grassroots work on the attribution and distribution of ethical responsibility across the AI ecosystem, and particularly more recently looking at production pipelines and where challenges exist in an ethical framework. And it's become very clear to us that simply believing that ethical principles will permeate through the process of AI without rigorous empirical investigation is faith misplaced. And so what we've been trying to do is to wonder, how can we give a value added to the process of ethical principles infusing the development of AI and the reliance on principle design. And one of the reasons that we've done this is to look for other normative frameworks that have very similar principle foundations to the ethical frames that we see, one referred to in the previous speaker's note, which is the model framework in Singapore, but there's a vast variety of very similar frames worldwide. What can they do, what can't they do, and what do they need? And it became very clear to us that, particularly in the COVID context, we're looking for three things which seem to be somewhat absent if there's an over-reliance on ethics on its own. One is authority. Does the state have authority to exercise the powers that it does in relation to the introduction of compulsory regimes of control? Second is legitimacy. Is there a legitimate measure that can be placed against the exercise of these powers? And finally, the question that I think is important is the question about the way in which enforceability, actionability can be given by the injection of rule of law into an ethical frame. And so we're interested to look at ways in which accountability, transparency can then sit with rule of law ideas like due process, enforcement, autonomy, those things which perhaps we hope for in terms of the exercise of an ethical frame, but there's no guarantees that these are possible. The other thing that comes into the project that Christian referred to indirectly was our third partner, BICL, and BICL has a wonderful history of working in rule of law through their associated with that, you had let's say the added value for our project of standardization, the work that they've done on rule of law standardization. Now, in Christian's presentation, he was talking about being able to measure applications to see if they complied effectively with rule of law frames. What I think is necessary for us to be able to do that is to have a standardization process that enables us to do ethics plus. And I'll finish on that point by simply saying the interesting thing about rule of law is that it has a wider level of acceptance and ascription worldwide, even than ethics does. And so if we're in a situation where we can marry the two, where we can look at ethics and the value that ethics gives us, the importance that it has for principle design, and then look for the value added that rule of law gives us and inject those together, then the project that we're trying to operate will not only, I think, enhance the acceptability of tracing and tracking apps, but also will give us a measure for surveillance societies post-pandemic. One of the Centre's great concerns that we're engaged in is looking at smart cities and the way in which we have mass data sharing and surveillance as essential within the smart city environment. If post-pandemic, citizens have become somewhat numb to the imposition of tracing and tracking and safe entry and a variety of other surveillance techniques, and we just simply accept them as normal ongoing, then I think the responsibility rests with researchers, with ethicists, with rule of law advocates to say, look, it's important for us, if we're going to accept as citizens, if we're going to have any concept of digital self-determination, then we must have measures that are empirically sound. And on top of that, I would argue that for citizens to be satisfied with comfort from ethics, then they must have the capacity to engage and act. And rule of law provides that.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really echo what you have said about rule of law and its importance. And thank you very much for these insights from Singapore. So now we have the last panelists who will be presenting together, as I understand. So Stefan and Jeannie, I understand, Stefan, you are going to go first.
Yes, thanks so much, Christoph, and I hope you can see my screen here. And it's a great way to connect with what Mark was saying at the end, because what we try to focus on in our project is really how does all this play out at the city level. And it is part of an initiative that we started here at GovLab, which we call AI Localism, i.e. how is AI being used at the local level, by which we mainly mean cities and states, for instance. But more importantly, how are those cities and states actually then going about governing the use of AI in an innovative way? Because one of the elements that we seek to test is to what extent are cities actually becoming laboratories of innovation in how AI is being governed and used. And then, of course, in this particular project, together with the University of Melbourne and with the Technical University of Munich, we then apply that to what is happening in the COVID space. But before we go there, I thought perhaps to first reflect, and then Jeannie can take it on into all kinds of directions within the context of our project, but is to first reflect on what we have seen and are seeing at the local level, because I think quite often in the research with regard to AI ethics, there is actually an absence of really taking stock of what is happening at the local level and what are the elements that we can learn from what is happening at the local level with regard to innovation in how AI is being governed. Now, there is no shortage of examples with regard to how AI is being introduced locally. I'm not going to go through all those examples, except for saying is that there's massive experimentation going on in cities worldwide with regard to the use of AI, whether it's robotics, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's Internet of Things that are being connected with machine learning. And so what we have been trying to understand is how do cities react from a governance point of view, from an ethical point of view. And so what we start to develop is actually a view that there are a whole range of initiatives happening in the vicinity of AI and AI ethics at the local level. And so this is the canvas that we are drawing at the moment with regard to actually taking stock of existing practices. And I'm just going to highlight a few of those practices. First one is that we see that cities are developing principles with regard to the use of digital, including AI. And so we have, for instance, the Cities for Digital Rights initiative, where about 20 cities have decided to actually develop their own manifesto on how they go about the use of digital, including AI. And that's quite often the result of an absence of actually a national framework or even a global framework that can steer them. And so we see cities stepping up with regard to developing their own principles. But not only stepping up, we actually see cities playing a role in becoming leaders in developing their own distinctive declaration with regard to AI. And so, for instance, we have the Barcelona Declaration for the proper development and usage of artificial intelligence. And then here in Montreal, we have the Declaration for Responsible AI, which are both those are examples where the cities are taking a leadership role in actually developing principles with regard to the use of AI. We also see cities, because of their closer connection with regard to citizens, we see innovation in how they are engaging citizens with regard to AI. And so we have, for instance, the open dialogue on AI ethics. And here in New York, which is an initiative that we initiated, we have, for instance, a citizens assembly around the use of data in AI as it relates to, for instance, COVID. And so that's another, what I believe is kind of innovative practice of cities with regard to AI and data. Not only see we engagement with citizens, but we also in those places where there are universities, local universities, we see actually a close engagement with universities in the development of ethical approaches. And so there we have an example from Flanders, where different organizations in different cities are working together with their local universities in order to come up with ethical approaches to the use of AI within cities, and the same thing in Montreal. Not only do we see an engagement with citizens and an engagement with universities, we see also cities really investing in actually creating a literacy around AI so that you can have a sophisticated debate around the use of AI. And so there, just an example, again, we have, for instance, in San Francisco, where a toolkit was built for city officials in order to understand what is the what are the ethical implications of AI and what are the impacts. And we see a variety of other examples. And here again, locally in New York, we are working with Queens Public Library, for instance. And I think the libraries play an important role in cities in order to actually embed literacy and also embed some kind of ethical approaches to AI. In addition to those so-called soft law kind of approaches, we see also actually really, and I think Mark already referred to the importance of the rule of law. We see actually the rule of law really peeping in to some of those ethical discussions. And so there is no shortage here in the US of almost every month there is another facial recognition ban that really imposes how certain kinds of AI is being used. But we see also other laws are popping up. And so, for instance, here in New York City, actually this week, tomorrow, there's a hearing on a law that would make mandatory, if you use AI for screening employees, it would make mandatory to have an auditing system attached to that. And so you see the law basically catching up with some of the applications. In addition to law, we also see increased oversight and experimentation with oversight. And I think, again, an element that is not, from my point of view, sufficiently studied is the role of judiciary in actually developing approaches to AI ethics and responsible AI. And this is an example, for instance, from the UK, where we see at the local level, where the judiciary are stepping up and actually evaluating the use of AI and whether it is lawful or unlawful. But in addition to the judiciary, you see also the creation of additional oversight mechanisms. And so here are two examples on where cities created oversight bodies in order to evaluate the use of AI. One that was in New York, and the other one was in Seattle, where they had the Surveillance Advisory Working Group, where they actually really tried to create new mechanism. Not everything is, of course, nirvana. Here in New York, there was a lot of critique on how a lot of critique with regard to the lack of access to actually real facts for the committee. And so the committee developed its own shadow report in order to actually complain. But that led to, a large extent, to then actually something really remarkable, well, not remarkable, but also a clear indication on where it is going. It led to actually the city establishing a dedicated policy officer with regard to the management of algorithms. And so that's, again, an innovation, which is an institutional kind of innovation that we see at the city level. Other innovations we see in transparency at the city level. For instance, this is the Helsinki Registry of Algorithms, where the city has decided to basically put all the details about the algorithms that the city is using and the AI that they are using on a public registry. They also are doing innovation in procurement. This is, for instance, an example of how Berkeley is actually procuring what they call surveillance technology, which quite often includes AI, and there are a whole range of procurement requirements that embed ethical principles to a large extent. So the question that we at the AI Localism project are trying to answer is that, are cities becoming the laboratories of AI governance? And obviously there are pros and cons with regard to AI localism. Pros is that it actually fills a void that this anyway provides for community empowerment. Cons is that if every city develops their own approach, you will see massive fragmentation. You actually also might have more capture by both political and commercial forces. And of course, cities are not always nirvana, right? So sometimes the politics of cities could actually lead to, anyway, what some call dark municipalism, where actually you have all kinds of forces that undermine human rights, for instance. And so that's the background in which we are developing our approach to AI localism as it relates to COVID-19. And Gianni will reflect on some of those elements from the concept from the perspective of Melbourne. I do also want to emphasize that together with the group here, we are also developing an AI ethics course, which will focus on global perspectives. And many of the people that you will hear today are also providing a lecture. And so this is something that we hope to launch in early January, so stay tuned. And then if you want to learn more about AI localism, that's where you could go. And so with that, I hope I didn't take too much time, but Gianni, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen now as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the applied case studies that we may look at, or a couple of the case studies that we may look at in the course of our project. So I'm going to look from the perspective of Australia, and in particular the city of Melbourne, which has been under one of the strictest lockdowns in Australia, but also globally in responding to COVID. And we're only just starting to move out of our houses and out of the 5K zone in which we've been confined. And so the project on AI localism is of great interest to us in Australia, albeit that the distribution of our population in Australia is probably different from the US and also different from Germany. So in fact, we have a good sort of comparison between the countries that are involved in this project. Most Australians live in cities, actually. So AI localism for us probably means city-based localism, but the contrast with less populated rural areas is also very interesting. We've got a federal system in Australia, so states have constitutional power over health and therefore over AI initiatives in responding to COVID, many of which have been unsuccessful or not high profile. The response to AI and technological initiatives in Australia and across the country has varied, and possibly citizens' attitudes to those initiatives have varied according to their experience of how their particular region has found the virus. So it's been we've had quite severe lockdowns in Melbourne, but for example, just WA had almost no cases, but is shut off from the rest of the country. How citizens' attitudes to those various initiatives might vary between the regions, but also according to their experience of COVID-19 is something that we would like to find out. And that's part of this project because, of course, public perceptions and expectations of citizens clearly influence the legitimacy and therefore the efficacy of regulatory efforts and also technological responses to viruses. So there's a number of reasons why we're so involved in the project. So in Australia, at the outset, the federal government, that's the overall government, introduced an app, the COVID Safe app, That was launched in April. It had a very low take-up amongst the citizens of Australia. Didn't even reach 40% of the population, which has been an aim of the government. And there was clearly a lack of trust in the government initiative, including in respect to privacy, but also in relation to the efficacy of the app, whether it actually worked. And by July, the app had been all but abandoned, but unfortunately there was a second wave of COVID, which meant other responses were needed to allow citizens to keep moving around the state, or at least maintaining, some sort of semblance of normal life. And what has arisen in its place is a variety of initiatives, but almost rather, I think, than the sort of example that Stefan spoke to of sort of coordinated governance efforts within different localities. I think almost what we've seen in Australia is almost a competitive environment, with each region trying to produce its own response, but with very little collaboration between different states, or indeed consultation with the citizens of those states. So, for example, we have in the state I live in, Victoria, our Premier wanted to introduce AI to help do COVID, to identify patterns of infection across the state based on information gained from contact tracing. Whether that's occurred, I don't know. Presumably he was looking at some level of natural language processing in responses to what people said about where they'd moved, and then use that to identify patterns of virus spread. By contrast, in South Australia, where there are relatively low numbers of COVID, the government introduced Zoe, the virtual assistant. As far as we can tell, this chatbot was introduced without any consultation with the community who would use it. In fact, the developers spoke about how they developed it in 6 days, and celebrating the amount of time that they managed to create this chatbot in a very small amount of time. But that meant there was necessarily no conversation with the local community. And it's interesting because if you go in to use that chatbot, the chatbot doesn't respond to you, for example, if you misspell your question, doesn't have any language correction, which somehow reduces the equity or the accessibility of that chatbot to all sorts of people, including myself, who's very bad at spelling. So that's the different local responses. The other interesting factor in Australia is that we've had a lot of public-private responses. And in fact, more confidence seems to have been put in private sector responses than in government responses. So in each state and territory, we've seen extensive use of QR codes to monitor the citizens' movements in public spaces. So Victorians and in other states, we've become used to scanning our phones when we enter a public space to record that we've been there. These QR codes, some of them are provided, in some states they're provided by the government and linked to public health data, but at least in the state that I'm in, these are provided by private providers. And so the question that we become interested in is that at least in Victoria, there seems to be a great deal of citizen or public acceptance of surveillance techniques by private entities in the form of QR codes, and also heat maps and movement tracking. So there's a lot of citizens' acceptance of private strategies for monitoring movement in the name of controlling the pandemic. And the question to us is, why is this so, when there was no trust in the federal government's movements? Raises lots of really interesting questions about why citizens are willing to hand information over to private entities when they weren't willing to do that to the government, when there's no guarantee about how those private entities will protect or use their data, or even whether it will be used for beneficial purposes such as public health initiatives. Now, the only way we find these questions out is by engaging with the citizens, with the community, to ask them, why do you put more trust in these entities than you do in government? Is there a difference in the trust with federal government, where clearly there is no trust, and perhaps in local government? Is this something local government could capitalise on with perhaps some of the initiatives in Australia that Stefan has mentioned, which we are not yet seeing here, but I would suggest that the community and the time is right for those conversations. So these are types of questions that we're hoping this project will shed light on, and perhaps we will see different sorts of initiatives in Australia to ask some of these questions that are raised by these various technologies. So that's all from me.
Well, thank you very much, Jeannie and Stefan, for these fascinating insights from different regions of the world. And it's very interesting to see, I mean, in general, how we are all and how our governments and regional authorities are trying to cope with the current crisis. And I just want to highlight again that this is also one of the reasons why we founded this Global AI Ethics Consortium, since there is a global challenge. The responses are different in different regions, but we should learn from each other. And that's something that's not something that can be accepted as being there, since learning is not something that's natural, unfortunately. Okay, so I would like to start with Q&A, and before coming to the questions, some of which have already been posted in the chat, I would like to at least have all the participants, or those who want, answer one general question, and that is actually why would you see why has AI governance become such a big issue? I mean, not just with the COVID crisis, which makes some things more obvious, but which have been there before. I would like to ask those who want, why did it become such a major issue, both AI ethics and AI governance? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll have a shot at that. I think there are two reasons, Christoph. One is that AI is understood in a very misperceived way, so that it doesn't matter what sort of AI application you're talking about. The general community in many ways finds great difficulty in being comfortable with AI in ways where perhaps these misperceptions are very deeply rooted in popular culture rather than in common sense or in good empirical research. The best example is with autonomous vehicles. I mean, everyone knows that the majority of injuries that are occurred in motor vehicle accidents come from human error, and yet you're not going to convince anybody that a driverless taxi is safe. We did an interesting piece of research recently with a small group, asking them firstly, did they accept if their surgeon came to them before the surgery and said, I'm going to use an elite robot to help in your surgery because he can do what I can't do, would you accept that? Yes, everyone said yes. The next question was, would you go to a robot dentist? And everyone said no. So, I mean, I think it's misperception, but I think the other thing too is that there has been such a concerted effort by governments and by the great tech firms to roll AI out and to do it primarily for profit without necessarily engaging the community early enough and richly enough so that they participated in that process. So I think part of the problem is created by the AI profits, and part of it's created by misperception.
Anyone else who would like to take up that question?
Yeah, Christoph, I mean, just a few reflections in addition to Mark's thing is that, I mean, to a large extent, obviously I agree with Mark, is that, anyway, quite often the AI governance discussion is reactive, right? And it's a result of actually what people see without having been engaged, despite the fact that I alerted to some experiments. Most of those are actually very exceptional, right? So there is not a wide spread engagement to a large extent, and so there's anyway, to a large extent, the AI governance discussion is a reactive one. In addition to that, I would say is that the AI governance discussion has actually been used as a wider discussion about agency, equity, and control. And I think that has been, and that's why so many actors are involved, is because actually the AI introduction has allowed them to surface more larger problems in society, whether these are problems of bias, discrimination, agency. And so that's to a large extent why AI governance has become such an issue, is because it actually relates to other topics that have been ignored for a long time. And AI governance allows them to actually put it front and center. And I think that's the another reason why I think the whole discussion about AI ethics, AI governance is really important, because to a large extent it goes about how society is organized. And if you put AI on top of that, it actually unearths some kinds of fundamental flaws that people now suddenly start to actually become very vocal about. So that's another reason I think why AI governance is so central and important.
Thank you. Anyone? Jeannie?
I was just going to say, yes, so the issues are socio-technical issues rather than purely technical issues. So the translation of the attempt to solve complex social problems through what's effectively statistics and data does, I agree with Stefan, lay bare some social problems, and bias is a really good example. The other point I'd add, though, is often if AI wasn't called AI, we'd regard it as a product and we're subject to quite rigorous standards of does it actually work? But because it's called AI, that critical inquiry is, does it really actually work? Does it do what we're asking it to do? Somehow gets lost and forgotten, which I think goes to Mark's point about the public being bedazzled by the term.
Yeah, sure.
Including researchers. I'm not holding us apart from that.
Great. Any other opinions? Otherwise, I would take the first questions from the digital floor. So one question that came up was asked in the chat was it was directed to Mark and Christian regarding rule of law. Do you envisage siloing per different functions? For example, legislation for AI ethics in the health industry, in entertainment, and in finance, or will a general use be equally applicable?
Yeah, I think we're having discussions about that because you can silo or try to, for example, if you standardize, try to direct the standard towards different functionalities, different technologies or uses. And that's obviously a big challenge. But on the other hand, the question would be also to from each use case to generalize what we can say generally. So I think it depends also on what we do. If we, for example, really engage into critical design, then it's more specific. On the other hand, a rule of law standard could have even different forms of abstraction as some standards do. This could be then, we could, of course, not do everything, but maybe a start that could be then continued in further projects to come.
Mm-hmm. I just add to that I think that through the standardization work that Bickel has done on the rule of law elements, the fundamentals, it's pretty clear that these sit in many different situations, industry, commerce, community, and many different political situations. But because of that, they can sometimes be used in ways that are not helpful, so that many political leaders would say that they agree with rule of law, and they could be Gaddafi on the one hand and they could be Nelson Mandela on the other, and they both say that they're rule of law leaders. But I think where it becomes much more applied is when you look at the way in which rule of law becomes institutional and process-based. So when it starts doing things, when it starts giving remedies to people or offering opportunities to resolve conflict or whatever. And that, unfortunately, in the world in which we live, requires us to return to regional law or to jurisdictional law. And that might mean that there's less global reach for rule of law in its action form. Just on that, though, I would say something that's encouraging, that I think that the pandemic has made us realize that rule of law isn't just about courts and litigation. It's about alternative dispute resolution. It's about community conflict resolution. It's about a whole range of different mechanisms, institutions, and processes for citizens to action their concerns about particular violations of principle. So that I think Christian is exactly right, that it will be sectoral because obviously the concerns that nation states have are about harm in particular places. But I think that if we can balance that standardization against a more flexible institutional and process dimension, then we've got a wider chance to make rule of law more generally helpful.
Thank you. Then here's another question directed to Stefan. The data assembly that you mentioned sounds very interesting. Could you please elaborate more on the format and the outputs these assemblies produce? Some technical details must be complicated for the broader public. How do you tackle that?
Great, thanks, Christophe. And I was about to wonder whether you would ask the question about my dog that goes berserk each time when I use the term AI and data, meaning it shows that, anyway, he has heard it too often. And also, by the way, I think feels that animals are not enough consulted when AI is being developed. But on the data assembly side, and actually it's very interesting because our project with Gianni and with Matthias is actually moving into the direction of really trying to understand what are citizens' expectations as a result of some of the work that Matthias and Gianni and we have done and we, of course, in the context of data assembly. And so what we did with the data assembly was to really within New York City, take stock of what are people's expectations with regard to the use of AI as it relates to COVID-19. And so we organized 3 mini publics. One involved data holders and technologists, as well as public officials. Another one involved citizens' rights organizations, including organizations representing migrants or representing the homelessness, for instance, in New York City. And then the third mini public was a randomized selected group of New York residents. And what we did with all those groups was basically present exhibits, i.e. this is a potential use case, in most cases real use cases, but without actually anyway taking real names of actors involved. How would you react to that? And more importantly, what would be the conditions under which you would feel this would be more trustworthy? And indeed, part of the question that was posed in the chat, I guess, was that how do we deal with a different level of understanding? And that's also what we've tried to actually test, because not only did we introduce the exhibit, we also introduced term. For instance, one of the exhibits was the use of aggregated and anonymized data from mobile phone operators. And so before we went there, we first tested the awareness and the understanding. Do you know what aggregated and anonymized data means? And it turns out that anyway, 70% had no clue, right? And so it shows that you actually do need to have a certain literacy to actually have this kind of citizens engagement. We introduced then a definition so that they actually understood, and that changed actually the conversation as well. And so those citizens assemblies are great opportunities not only to assess the expectations and feel and opinions, but also great opportunities to actually for education, because they provide also opportunities to actually go deeper and explain what is actually really happening and under what kind of conditions. And so the outcome is, because it was not just deliberation, it was also co-creation, is basically a framework that for responsible data and AI that we're going to release next Monday, and basically it focuses on a few areas, because each time when we asked, and then I will stop, each time when we ask people, what do you feel, what's your reaction to this, right, and the exhibit? Well, I think the important element is that it's never binary, right? It's never, oh, I don't want this, or I do want this. It's always, this is interesting, but it depends. And so what we are trying to do with this framework is to really spell out the what it depends. And it depends on what data we are talking about. It depends on what kind of technology we're talking about. It depends on who is actually using it and with whom it is shared. It depends on when it is being used and for what purpose, and so on. And so having an understanding of the ingredients that leads to people say it depends, and also the ingredients that lead to actually a responsible way is what we are going to release. And this is also what we are testing out with Gianni and with Matthias, is can we actually do this in different contexts using different methodologies, but I do feel like we need to actually get the people also at the center of the of our understanding in order to inform those responsible AI discussions.
Okay, here was another question posed actually by one of our researchers, by Georg Groh. It was posed to all in an environment with a growing complexity, with a growing technological complexity, be it machine learning or genetic technology. And when it comes to the question, how can we implement democratic control on those? Isn't it in the end a question of trusting teams of maybe elected experts to certify the do's and the don'ts based on straightforward guiding principles? So the question is trust the real currency? Is that all we have? Maybe this might seem naive, but is that all we have?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because it speaks to actually implementing things. And I think whether you come from ethics, from governance, from the rule of law, that's always will always be a key question. But there are governance mechanisms to do that. I think the whole idea of responsible research and innovation is to also impact on design processes and have effective governance mechanisms that takes the work that is done in these projects and really applies it there. Just to give you one example of data protection, where data protection officers are on the ground and really help to implement data protection. I think among all the rules and the fines in data protection law, this might be the most effective way if you have people on the ground. But it speaks to much more. It speaks to education. It speaks to, I think this is what Stefan has also mentioned. It speaks to capacitating people to, on both sides, on the social science side, on the ethics side, but also on the technical side, to understand each other and to implement this. So this is a huge challenge. But I think there are some ways, if you have agents for these causes to do that. I think there is at least a possibility.
Christoph, may I add to that? I agree with Christian's response. I think that's quite useful to have that understanding and broaden the understanding between the different groups of users. I would draw the analogy also to the current situation in the beginning of the lockdown periods around the world, where the issue of trust and legitimacy in governments changed very quickly in a short space of time, depending on how they dealt with the crisis and the kind of measures they introduced and how they managed that. So with AI as well, if we develop the acceptable legal principles and build that into systems, together with that certainly is a process of creating that trust and legitimacy in the system, in the legal frameworks around that, and also in the decision makers that are going to use that. So trust, I would say, goes with legitimacy. And in particular, one can link it to one of the key principles of accountability. But it is a journey that one will go on, as Christian indicated, which partly relates to the education of different actors in the process as well.
And yeah, I think that's right. I think it does relate to different actors in the process, but I'm always cautious when we start talking about experts, because experts are just a group of people who've taken control of the discussion about, you know, new technologies that appear complex but perhaps aren't. And I know that everybody here has talked about education, but if we don't go and talk to people, we just get a group of experts that are talking to each other and making decisions about what education is needed without actually understanding, I think, perhaps, about how communities are experiencing new technologies and AI. And often, in fact, we're not listening to how communities are experiencing AI, particularly perhaps communities that aren't in the forefront. The example I gave earlier of the chatbot is, I think, a good example, because that chatbot was designed by a group of technologists and administrators who celebrated the fact they were able to design that chatbot quite quickly, where I think if you went out and talked to the type of people who maybe have to use that chatbot, the functionality and the usability isn't actually there. So yes, we probably may need experts to certify trustworthy AI, but I think trust comes from listening to communities and understanding what they want from AI and the types of standards and rules and principles that are useful to them, and then embodying those in governance mechanisms, rules, laws, and so on.
I just add to what Jeannie said, that I had a rather heated argument earlier today, with some scientists and scientific professionals about the fact that they believe that people should trust them. And my point that I was making is that trust is not something that's given, it's something that's earned. And it's earned on the basis of the fact that the people you want to trust you have got to have a reason for it. And I think that there's been too much paternalism associated with artificial intelligence, and certainly with mass data sharing. And there's been a lot of hubris, and there's been a lot of concealment, and there's also been a lot of just, I think, contempt for the general community, in that the benefit of AI in many respects is supposed to be for all of us, and yet most of us don't understand it. Now, if that's true, you can't then turn around and say, well, trust us. I really feel very strongly about this, that if we are going to develop technologies that rely on citizen trust, and we don't have to, we can develop technologies that couldn't care less about citizen trust. But if we believe that citizen trust is an element to make technologies work, like tracking and tracing devices, then if we turn around and simply say, trust us because we know and you don't, that's a recipe for disaster. And I really think that it's an essential question for researchers and for scholars in the field to deconstruct and unpack trust, because trust is a relationship, it's not a thing. And so if people trust something, or something is given to them to trust, then that relationship needs to be established on more than just simply your professional standing. I'll finish on this point because it's important. I raised the issue today about the widespread distrust in the US about the scientific community and the way in which the evidence was being put forward about what people should safely do in relation to COVID protection. And the response was, oh, well, that's all just fake news. Well, that's true, but people don't accept fake news because they're stupid. They accept fake news because they want to believe it. And if they want to believe it, then on the basis of that, they've got a substantive distrust. And I think it's a tragedy that science is being distrusted in the pandemic, but that's a good challenge for scientists and for those who support scientists and technology to go out there and sell it. And I think that it's important that we do that in a way which is not just simply dismissive, but is engaging.
And I think thank you very much for your answers here. And I think what this makes clear is also, again, the point that we need this interdisciplinary collaboration about the subject. It's something that you just can't hand over only to the science in the sense of the English term of scientists and let's say people from engineering maybe and computer scientists. But as you know, those who speak German know German is that we use this term Wissenschaft in a much broader sense. And I'm not saying it's better here in Germany, but it just, I think it highlights that AI ethics is something that we should work on in this interdisciplinary way, with both the technical and the non-technical side highlighted. There was another question in the chat from one of our panelists that comes later. And it was mainly directed to Christian about your presentation on the non-phone users that were not included in the case of the German study of AI track and trace tools. Is it possible to find a manual entry somehow for such people, including those without smartphones that do not use the internet, and how practical might that be?
That's a very good question. That's a question about design alternatives, and the question is always how far you go. So, or whether you still think within the specific technology you're using, for example, contact tracing. So can we produce, like with Raspberry Pis or very small entities, can we produce alternatives that would be, if somebody really would like to have it, that are there? Or do we maybe change the whole system we're thinking about? And in the second space with the Chroniton app, the QR-based app, we thought, for example, about libraries, that there is maybe a terminal computer where you, or maybe if students come to exams and they don't have their mobile phone with them, that we then have a laptop or a terminal computer. Of course, you would have to disinfect that as well, but in order to people having their data inside there, so. In order to include them, whether they have a smartphone or not, whether they have their smartphone with them or not. So I think that's a very tricky question, and it depends on the specific case. But also, as Jeannie said, you have to think about that in a socio-technical sense. So it might be also possible to complement this with measures completely outside of technology and offer special assistance, or try to tackle this with measures that have nothing to do with smart technology, and that's also something that also always has to be kept in mind. So it's not only a technical fix, but there is many possibilities to do that.
Yes, I would like to finish with a last round of answers on a relatively general question. And that is, it was also posed here in the chat. It was brought up by someone before, and that is do you think the willingness to give more personal data to private providers regarding COVID, will it negatively impact the progress of AI ethics in the long run? And you could maybe give a final or concluding very short statement. We have around 3 minutes. Who would like to start? Stefan?
Well, meaning the question is the statement correct, right? Meaning, and obviously, I think there is a lot of data generation. I think what has happened in the context of COVID-19 is that many people actually started to understand that data that was collected for one purpose could be used for other purposes, whether they are comfortable with that. Anyway, that's what we try to understand. And I think the big message that we got here is that, yes, meaning urgency to deal with a pandemic is important, but you cannot respond to urgency without accountability. And so we do need to match urgency with accountability in order to deal with COVID-19. And I think that's what we have to figure out. What are those accountability mechanisms? The other element, which is related to one of the questions as well, I guess somewhat, is that we also have to come up with new ways to actually document efficacy. Because a lot of the tools, anyway, claim to provide for a solution, whether this is technological, deterministic or not, but we don't have that much actually assessment of the efficacy of some of those tools. And absent that kind of efficacy, it will not be trusted, and it would also not actually advance AI, because we won't be able to know whether something actually works or does not work. Now, the question is, of course, what are the metrics to measure efficacy? And I think that's something that we should focus on, perhaps as a group here, in order to inform that debate as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jeannie?
I actually typed an answer.
Okay.
And I
okay.
said, it's
Thank you
done.
very much.
So
I mean,
you.
this is great. Also, to all those who post other questions, we will try to answer them in the chat as well. Christian, do you have anything to say?
Maybe just two short points. First, what is this willingness to give data to private companies in COVID-19 based on? I think we would have to have a deep look into that. My educated guess would be that on the one hand, it's also about usability. So it's not only about trust in data protection, but it's about usability, the return, the good design that in a way lures me into using certain apps. So I wouldn't think about this as a public vote on who to give my data on. But on the other hand, and there I link again to Mark, Stefan, and Jeannie's, and also Dirk's, actually all the other projects on the panel. We have to know that there is an individual side to data governance, and people have to understand that. So that it has this aspect of a very important decision that also impacts on AI. And I think there is a lot of projects going into that way to make people understand, but also to give them an infrastructure to handle their data. I think once people start doing that, I think this will also push for AI ethics, because then everybody will understand how important AI ethics is. Also the people doing the systems and programs.
Great, thank you. Dirk, a final comment from you?
Thank you, Christoph. Just shortly, I think looking at the developments for the future, the rule of law approach certainly is crucial and would provide a very sound platform to work from, that we don't end up in silo legislation on specific fields, as one of the questions highlighted, but that we have a general approach that can be adapted to different contexts and different circumstances. We have that example from rule of law and human rights already.
Thank you. Mark, did you have a final comment, or do you want to submit it in the chat?
Yeah, just very quickly, the public-private divide is now, I think, completely clouded. We just did some research recently on whether people in Singapore were happy to give their health records to their doctor and not to a government official. And it was doctor, yes, government official, no, forgetting the fact that the information going to the doctor goes to the government official anyway. So I think it is a question of, does the data subject know where the data goes?
Okay. Thank you. So the effort to make sure that technologies are beneficial to society needs to be a globally collaborative one. I think this has become clear in this session. Academia, with its broad access across different disciplines and cultures, can connect and build international research communities, collaborative networks, and global consortia working together on AI ethics-related issues. And that's exactly why the IEAI joins forces with academic institutions, with research centers, and distinguished members of the academia worldwide. We have launched the GAIEC and funded these multidisciplinary research proposals that seek to study and design research-based concrete and practical solutions for issues related specifically to ethics and the use of AI in health-related crises. So I would like to thank once again Dirk, Christian, Mark, Jeannie, and Stefan for accepting this invitation, and all of you for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your questions, comments, and remarks. And we proceed now immediately to our second session of the event. The topic of this session will be AI ethics and online behavior. And I give the floor to the moderator of the next panel, my colleague from TUM School of Governance, Matthias Uhl. Thank you very much.